They called it the jumping off point. The towns along the Missouri River, Independence, St. Joseph, Westport, where the wagon trains assembled in spring, where families loaded everything they owned into a box 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, said goodbye to everyone they were not taking with them, and pointed themselves west into a continent that most of them had never seen. The phrase jumping off point was not accidental. It captured something that the immigrants themselves understood at the moment of departure, that what lay ahead was a discontinuity, not a journey from one known place to another known place. A leap into the genuinely unknown, with everything you owned and everyone you loved on the wagon behind you. Between 1840 and 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad made the overland wagon journey unnecessary, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people made that leap. They went along the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail. They moved at the pace of the oxen pulling their wagons, 15 miles on a good day, less when the rain came, less when the river crossing went wrong, less when someone got sick, which was often. 5 months. In the best cases, 4.5. In the worst, the journey stretched into 7, into late autumn, into the mountain passes that could close with the first significant snowfall of October and become death traps for anyone still inside them. The dark reality of the Oregon Trail is not the dramatic Indian raids that appear in the popular mythology. It is far more ordinary than that, and far more universal. It is the reality of bodies in an environment that was working against them every day: the cold, the wet, the bad water, the inadequate food, the absence of any of the medical support that might have kept the sick alive. It is a reality that most people who made the journey survived, and a reality that killed enough of them that we should understand it clearly. This video is that understanding. Let's begin with the cold. Because the cold of the Oregon Trail is not a winter phenomenon that the immigrants could avoid by timing their departure correctly. It is a reality that followed them through the journey and reached its most lethal expression in the mountain crossings that stood between the high plains and the Pacific. The Overland Trail was a seasonal enterprise. You had to leave in late April or early May, after the spring mud in Missouri had dried enough to support wagon travel, but early enough that you could clear the mountain passes before the October snows closed them. This window was tight. Miss the departure by 3 weeks, and you might still make it, but the margin for disaster disappeared. Miss it by 6 weeks, and you were gambling with lives. The families who got the timing wrong, or who were delayed by illness or accident, found themselves in the mountains as the temperature dropped and the days shortened. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada in October of 1846, is the extreme case. But the cold that killed them was the same cold that challenged every immigrant who crossed the mountains. Understanding what that cold actually meant for a family sleeping on the ground beside a wagon is to understand something that does not come through in the textbook accounts. At altitude, in the mountain sections of the trail, summer nights can drop to temperatures that are genuinely dangerous for people with inadequate shelter and inadequate bedding. The passes that the trail crossed, South Pass in Wyoming at over 7,000 feet, the various Sierra Nevada crossings at even higher elevations, had summer days that could be warm and pleasant and nights that could be cold enough to produce frost on the wagon canvas. The immigrants slept in those conditions in blanket rolls on the ground. The ground itself was cold. Heat loss through conduction from a body on the earth at altitude is significant and continuous. The blankets that most immigrants brought were wool, which provided real insulation and retained warmth even when damp, but which could not compensate indefinitely for the combination of ground cold, air cold, and the particular body-draining cold of a mountain environment at elevation. What happened to a family sleeping in these conditions over weeks and months was a slow physical depletion that made every other challenge harder. Sleep was interrupted by cold, by camp sounds, by animals that needed checking, by children who woke. The rest it provided was insufficient for the demands of the next day. Walking. The immigrants walked. The popular image is of families riding in the wagon, sheltered from the elements. The reality is that the wagon was full of supplies. Adults and older children walked beside it for most of the day, 12 to 15 miles on foot across terrain that was sometimes firm, sometimes actively muddy, and in the mountain sections, climbing grades steep enough that adding human weight to the wagon load could mean the difference between the oxen making it and not. The feet of the immigrants bore the evidence of the journey. Blisters that calloused over into something survivable, or became infected into something that could kill. The immigrants who brought in inadequate footwear, city shoes, thin-soled boots not designed for months of rough terrain, learned this lesson in ways that were sometimes permanent. The specific misery of wet feet in cold conditions, of walking for hours through grass wet with morning dew or across a rain-soaked plain or through the shallow water of a creek crossing, produced consequences that could not be undone by the fire that evening. Trench foot, though not called by that name until the First World War, was a known and dreaded condition on the Overland Trail. Tissue damage from sustained exposure to cold and wet was a real and documented danger, and the immigrants who suffered it were dealing with an injury that significantly impaired their ability to continue the journey. Now, let's talk about the water, because the water of the Oregon Trail is one of the primary killers of the overland journey, and it worked in ways that the immigrants of the 1840s and 1850s could not fully understand. Germ theory did not exist as a practical medical framework until the 1860s. The immigrants who crossed in 1849 and 1850 had no way to understand that the water making them sick contained living organisms too small to see. They knew that some water made you sick. They did not know why. The consequence was that cholera, Vibrio cholerae, which requires contaminated water to spread, followed the trail with a fidelity that was not coincidental. The wagon companies drank from the same water sources, camped at the same sites, and deposited their waste in proximity to those water sources in exactly the same ways that ensured the pathogen would spread from one company to the next down the trail. Cholera killed within days. That is not a dramatic generalization. It is a physiological fact. The disease produces such severe dehydration through diarrhea and vomiting that a person who is healthy in the morning could be dead by the following morning. The speed of death was one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the epidemic years on the trail. 1849, 1850, 1852, because it meant that the person who had been driving the wagon beside you at noon might be buried at the side of the trail by evening. The response to cholera on the trail was largely helpless. Treatments of the period addressed symptoms rather than causes and often made things worse. The correct treatment, aggressive rehydration, was not understood. People died who might have survived with the simple replacement of the fluids they were losing. The trail became marked with their graves. The estimate that one grave marks every 80 yards of the Oregon Trail is widely cited and widely documented. That translates to roughly 10,000 graves along a trail of approximately 2,000 miles. Not all of those deaths were cholera. Accidents, drowning, and other diseases claimed lives throughout, but cholera in the epidemic years accounts for a significant fraction. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 30,000 people died on the overland trails between 1840 and 1870. Those numbers need context. The mortality rate of the overland trail, perhaps 2 to 5% in typical years, higher in epidemic years, was significant but not prohibitive. The vast majority of people who made the journey arrived, but the families who made it were traveling through a corridor that the deaths of others had marked, and they knew it, and the psychological weight of knowing it was real. Now let's talk about sleep. Because the sleep of the overland trail was as compromised as every other physical necessity of the journey, and the compromise accumulated over 5 months into a debt that the immigrants carried in their bodies to the end. The bedroll was the sleeping technology, while blankets spread on a ground cloth wherever the day ended. In the plains, this was often adequate. In the mountains, it was often not. Rocky, sloped, wet from earlier rain. Tents were brought by some families, but added time to the end and beginning of each day. Most families found the blanket roll under the open sky was the practical norm, with the wagon canvas pulled down as a windbreak when conditions required it. Children slept in the wagon when space permitted, and space was arranged to permit it when the weather was worst. Infants born on the trail required the warmth that only proximity to a parent's body could provide. Immigrant accounts of managing infant care on the trail are among the most moving documents of the period. The simultaneous demands of keeping a newborn alive and keeping the family moving west, balanced through circumstances that would have challenged the most capable parents in optimal conditions. The night watch further fragmented the sleep of adult men. Oxen and mules required guarding against stampede and theft. Men rotated through shifts, and the man whose shift ended at 2 in the morning had to be back at the wagon by 4. This was the rhythm of the journey, accepted as the cost of safe passage. Now let's talk about food. Because the feeding of a family for 5 or 6 months from the contents of a wagon, supplemented by whatever the land provided, was one of the most complex logistical challenges of pioneer life, and one where failure had immediately life-threatening consequences. The immigrant guidebooks circulated carefully calculated provisions lists. The basics: flour, salt pork or bacon, dried beans, coffee, sugar, salt, vinegar, and dried fruit, covering caloric requirements of heavy labor and shelf stability requirements of 5 months without refrigeration and temperatures ranging from below freezing to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The most important items on the list were dried fruit and vinegar, which provided vitamin C. Without it, scurvy develops after 4 to 12 weeks, fatigue, joint pain, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, skin that bruise from the slightest contact. Families that had run out of vitamin C sources by the midpoint might arrive with members showing symptoms of genuine severity. Those who understood this protected their dried fruit supply above almost anything else. Those who did not learn from their bodies. Cooking happened at the campfire twice daily. The morning fire was started before light, coffee boiling before the sun was up, bacon fried in the pan, biscuits in the Dutch oven if there was time, and fuel, coffee in the tin cups that went into every pack without question. The evening meal was the more substantial preparation. Beans soaked since the previous evening, salt pork fried or stewed, bread baked. The particular skill of cooking dried beans at altitude, where water boils at lower temperatures and beans take significantly longer to soften, was one of the practical lessons the mountain sections taught. Wild game supplemented the diet, particularly in the early years when the bison herds of the plains were still intact. Bison meat was consumed fresh, dried, and jerked for later use. It was nutritionally excellent. By the 1850s and 1860s, the herds along the trail were diminished by successive years of immigrant hunting, and later travelers were more dependent on their wagon supplies. River crossings were the most dangerous single events of the overland journey, and they concentrated the practical challenges of the trail into moments of acute risk. The trail crossed the Platte, the North Platte, the Green River, the Snake River, and dozens of smaller crossings. The Snake River crossings in Idaho were among the most dreaded, cold, fast, deep, with a current that could overturn a wagon or sweep a child away in the time it took to recover from the shock of the cold. Wagon crossings were managed by removing weight, sometimes waterproofing the bed with grease, and driving the oxen into the current. When it went well, the family was wet and spread everything to dry at camp. When it went wrong fast. Drowning at river crossings was a documented cause of death. Children who fell from wagon tongues into the current, men pulled under while helping struggling oxen, women unhorsed while crossing on horseback. These were not extraordinary accidents. They were the ordinary risks of doing something physically dangerous in uncontrolled conditions. After the crossing, the wet clothing. Wet clothing in a cold environment is a genuine physiological threat, accelerating heat loss through conduction and evaporation simultaneously. The immigrants who emerged from a difficult crossing on a cold day and whose spare clothing was also wet were in a situation that required everything the evening fire could provide to prevent genuine cold injury. The fire was not a comfort feature of the overland journey. It was an operational necessity. A family that ran out of fuel, or whose fire would not start in the same rain that was drenching their bedding, was a family in genuine difficulty. The fuel of the plains, buffalo chips, the dried dung of the bison herds, was an acquired skill. The women who cooked over them learned which chips burned hot and which only smoked. They carried chips in bags hung from the wagon for stretches where chips were scarce. The management of fuel was as constant a concern as the management of water and food. What the Overland Trail produced in the people who survived, it was not the toughness of mythology. It produced something more complex, a practical intelligence adapted to conditions of genuine scarcity and genuine risk. The woman who could bake bread over buffalo chips in a wind on a cold morning after sleeping on wet ground was not tough in a performative sense. She was competent in a way that the comfortable world could not test and could barely recognize. The Oregon Trail was not where heroism lived. It was where the ordinary human requirements of sleep and warmth and food and clean water became extraordinary problems, and where ordinary people found or failed to find the solutions. Most of them found them. Most of them arrived, and they built the Western United States with the knowledge the trail had given them. Knowledge of what the body needed and what happened when it did not get it. The wagon is loaded. The jumping-off point is behind them. The continent is ahead, cold and real and not interested in the imaginations they brought to it. They're already walking. If this video gave you something worth knowing, please like it and share it with someone who would appreciate understanding how things actually were. Subscribe for more honest explorations of how people have lived throughout history. See you in the next one.